welcome back to another episode of It's Not What You Think. This is Darren.
And this is Rick.
And today's episode revolves around the years 300 to 400.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this would be great to revisit the Oxyrhynchus hymn, because I think that's the launch pad for the next couple hundred years is
Right.
Christian chants.
Yes.
And so we can cut to the music. So, in last episode, 200, 300, we did a spotlight on St. Cosmas.
Mm-hmm.
Optisan epigetis avisu notidos amiri que anecalipsis thalassis Hymenus ista themeria, ti categidi nevmati, taftis gare petimisas, periusion laon desosas adonda, epinicion hymnon Kyrie.
I think the lives of the saints, the stories of the lives of the saints, whether they're completely true or not, are really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked up St. Cosmas and why he became a saint, and it was largely because he was tortured during the time. Right, what did we find out that time period was? 313?
Right up until the Edict of Milan?
Yeah.
That was 313.
313? So right up to that. So I think around 303, actually,
Right.
was when he was being tortured. And it said that he sustained no physical injury for all of his tortures. They tortured him with fire, they tortured him with water, they tortured him on the cross, so I guess that means they tried to crucify him, and the only way they were able to kill him was to cut his head off, behead him. And so they could. I think that was like the final miracle that said, okay, this guy's a saint. In addition to all of the medical practices that he did, and all the healing that he did in the surgeries, and he wouldn't take any money for any of it. So he was a really good guy, is how they say. And and then the story about his body being impervious to physical injury. So I thought that was a neat story, and I wanted to look up other stories of the saints because today focuses on the early Christian fathers,
Mhm.
the years 300 to 400. And as you mentioned, the Edict of Milan, that's when they said, okay, we need to stop killing the Christians. And so here you have St. Ambrose comes to the foreground and St. Augustine comes to the foreground.
Right.
And we're going to get to them. But before we get to them and focus on the saints, let's mention this gentleman here, Gregory Nazianzus. You want to tell us what you learned about him?
So, from what I can tell, he was a Christian theologian, effectively. He combined Hellenistic features with early Christian traditions.
What are Hellenistic features?
So it's like
You mean Colin of Troy?
Yeah, yeah. I think actually that's where the name comes from. But yeah,
Okay.
it's Greek.
Mhm.
So it's sort of adapting the Greek mode of logic onto early Christian thought.
Mhm.
He also was apparently a poet, so he wrote some poetry. But as far as I can tell, his great accomplishment in the realm of Christianity is the foundation of the theologian traditions, right? So that now they're thinking about Christianity in a different way
Okay.
because of him.
Wow. And we have a fragment of a poem that he wrote. Very little that I can find that we can pinpoint. We know that this is composed between 300 and 400.
Right.
And so we have to grasp just about everything we can.
Right.
And this is a very short fragment. When I say fragment, like, soundbite type of a fragment.
A sentence.
Yeah. But let's give it a listen to.
Partheni megafere theos dote dotoreaor. Miterapi mocini.
Now it's questionable whether the music was part of the composition by Greg.
Right.
I think I can call him Greg. We're on a first name basis.
Right. He seems like a pretty cool guy.
Yeah. But what they did, though, or what I noticed the recording artist did, was they recited the poem. They threw a little bit of embellishment in the speaking so that it became more of a melodic speech,
Mm-hmm.
and then they reproduced that on the instruments. So da 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 da.
Right.
Is the natural formation of the words, and then they repeated that with the musical instruments. Dun, 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 dun.
Right. And that's I think commonplace at this time, and
Right.
and even we see it sort of when we were listening to the Confucian music, sort of the same
Right.
driving force, same melody type,
Mhm.
with following the syllables again as always.
Right. Musical speech is kind of what it becomes.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And like you said, it's very short.
Yeah.
I wish I knew what he was saying.
Yeah, we tried looking it up and we couldn't find
Yeah.
the translation for it.
Yeah, there are, from what I can tell, he's written a lot of poems that have survived.
Mhm.
And so I think that this is a fragment from a poem. It's probably just two sentences that are profound in some way that they...
My
they took
intuition
out.
tells me he's saying chickpea flour is appropriate for women of all ages.
Yeah, it seems... these themes persist.
Yeah. And if you don't know what that is, go back and watch a previous episode.
But it's nice. I don't think it was all that bad for
No.
early Christian chanting.
Yeah, exactly.
If the music composition, which I don't think that it is, I think the words are original. I think the music is sort of
Yeah, I agree.
imagined, and they probably used a Greek style of music because he wrote in Greek. It's in Greek,
Mhm.
so they probably just abstracted that ancient Greek form onto his poem.
It makes sense. We can move over to St. Ambrose.
Well, before we do, I want to mention, since we're still on the Greeks,
Yeah.
that it's interesting that you brought up the story of the saints, because to
Mhm.
me it strikes me as an abstraction from the ancient Greek myths. Right,
Mhm.
Christianity at this point is now creating myths. Now, there's
Right.
nothing to say that Saint Cosmas is the story of Saint Cosmas is true,
Mhm.
and it's fanciful in the way that a myth is. That you would
Mhm.
imagine, like, oh, selected by the gods, nothing could harm him. And,
Right, like Hercules.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It just struck me that, and ironically, as we're still with the ancient Greeks, it
Mhm.
just struck me that the story of the saints was the Greek way, or the Christian way of creating a mythos.
Right. And we said previously, and we'll continue to repeat, that when you want to define yourself against another group, then you emphasize the differences. And that's
Mhm.
what Christianity starts to do with the chanting, that they
Mhm.
start to emphasize these solo vocal chanting to set themselves apart from the instrumentalists and the dancing in the streets type of culture.
Right.
But they're bound to draw, even unconsciously, from the group that they're living side by side with.
Right.
And so they're bound to draw from those Greek myths. And so
Right.
it makes sense, like you're saying, that the Christian saints would have a flavor of some of the Greek mythology.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just, while you were describing the story, it just struck me. I was like, I feel like there's a Greek myth that's
Yeah,
something
yeah.
similar to this.
Yeah,
So,
Achilles.
right.
Achilles was impervious from harm.
Except for his ankles.
Right, yeah.
So,
Great. I'm glad you brought that up.
and we'll never be rid of the ancient Greeks, unfortunately. They're going to persist.
Or fortunately.
Perhaps.
Verum condido, noctem diemque qui regis, et temporum das tempora, ut alleves fastidium. Preco die iam sona, noctis profunde pervigi, nocturna lux viantibus, a notte noctem segregas. Hoc excitatus lucifer, solvit polum caligine, hoc omnis erronum cos, vias nocendi deseri. Hoc nauta vires colligi, pontique mites cum freta, hoc ipse pretre ecclesiae, canente culpam diluit. Surgamus ergo strenue, gallus iacentes exita, ex somnolentus increpa, gallus negantes arguit.
Okay, this is written by St. Ambrose, who was alive around 339 AD to 397 AD. And they can confidently say he wrote 4 pieces, 4 chants. Some give him credit for 12, but those other are disputed, so I thought we'd just stick with the 4 that are
That we know, yeah.
that we guarantee are his.
Makes sense.
In that particular piece, it sounded very monastic.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree.
Mm-hmm.
It sounded like something that I would, and I assume that he was that Latin or was that Greek, do you know?
No, I don't.
I would assume that it's Greek
Mhm.
because of the time
Mhm.
period that we're working with.
Mhm.
But if you were to tell me that it was Latin, that was something that was done today in
Yeah.
some Catholic church,
Right.
I would believe it.
Yeah,
That
sure.
is what I imagine Catholic, like, high ceremonies sort of
Yeah.
look like, sound like.
Well, what's significant about St. Ambrose in the world of music is that the style of chant you just heard, they continued with, and he created what they call Ambrosian chant.
Ah, okay.
Now, I don't know the fine details about chant composition because we all know Gregorian chant, and that's based on the writings of Pope Gregory,
hmm
and it's different than Ambrosian chant. But how is that different? It could be something as simple as the starting note.
It thinking now about what we just listened to, I think that there was, if you were to break it down and actually write out the notes, I would think that there was some repetition there.
Mm-hmm.
That there was an al coda that comes back to the beginning.
Yeah,
and,
I agree.
And recycles it through until Amen, which is
Mhm.
that's the end.
Right.
And maybe that the pattern of the notes that you're taking and
Mhm.
the key that you're in is what sets the Ambrosian chant.
It could.
The time.
I wonder if it has to do with the language, because you just said that he might be singing in Greek. Maybe Ambrosian chant is specifically sung in Greek. I don't know.
It could be
maybe we can look
the
that up.
time signature. It could
Yeah.
be the melody that
Right.
that is consistent.
There's something, and we don't know 100% for sure.
Well,
But-
we'll have to stay tuned for the next songs because
Yeah,
if
there you
it
go.
follows the same note pattern of the one we just heard,
Good point. Then let's leap into that.
and then if it's the same time signature, perhaps maybe we'll
Right.
discover a trend as we go.
Okay.
Deus Creator omnium, qualique rector vesties, diem decoro lumine, noctem soporis gratia.
Aretus salutus ut quies redam amoris usui, mentesque fessas allever, luttusque solvat anxios.
Gratis speranto omnia, et noctis exortu preces. Motireus ut adium es, sim non calentes solvimus.
Te cordissima concinante vox honora concrepe, te dirigat castus amore, te vinsadorem sobria.
Ut cum profunda clauserit diem calidon obstium, fides tenebras nesciat, et nox videre luceat.
Dormire mentem nesinas, dormire culpa noveri, castos fides refrigerant, somni vapore tempere.
To simplify what we just learned, Ambrosian chant has a minimal amount of structure. Like, I think you used the perfect phrase, free flow.
Yeah.
So it seems to be a little more free flow. So it's definitely more elongated speech, musical speech.
Mhm.
When I'm speaking and I elongate it and just add longer vowels, now that becomes my melody.
Mhm.
And we just go with that. When we get to Gregorian chant, they use more fixed structure
Right.
and made it more composition song-like or chant-like.
Right.
That's that's what I gathered from the difference between the Ambrosian chant and the other chants that we'll come across.
Yeah, based on what you were reading, that's what it sounds like. Now they still follow the rules. I think there's modes, right? They utilize the same modes.
Not as strictly as Gregorian though.
Right,
it says.
right.
Yeah.
In terms of composition, not as strictly.
And it's interesting. We want to make sure that our viewer knows, because directly what we were saying before about having to separate yourself from the pagans, yet unconsciously drawing from their culture, that's what those modes were.
Right.
Those modes that you're referring to that have come to us, and we call them the church modes, they're patterns of notes, aka scales, if you will, and there are 7 of them, and those 7 are actually borrowed from the Greek system.
Right.
And so we don't call them the Greek system, we call them the church modes, but they were unconsciously pulled from the Greeks.
Yeah. Yeah, so they still follow some rules,
Mhm.
just it seems like not very many of them.
Yeah.
Which it's interesting that we're seeing this now in the sort of the distinction between Gregorian and Ambrosian chanting, because the distinction between Gregorian and Ambrosian chanting seems to me to be somewhat parallel to the distinction we see of the later composers between Bach and Beethoven.
Mm-hmm.
Bach was way more structured, mathematical. Beethoven
Yeah.
tended to draw out the time signatures in that long sort of way of his composition.
And put his own self into it rather than strictly use the structure.
Exactly. So it's interesting that we're seeing the inverse. Because
Yes.
Beethoven followed Bach. So
Mm-hmm.
you end up first creating the structure, whereas here I think Ambrosian it precedes Gregorian.
Right.
So they're finding the structure. They're honing in the structure then in
Right.
Gregorian, which will eventually I think inspire the later composers, and then
Mhm.
Beethoven sort of breaks the mold.
Yeah,
come
yeah,
back
yeah.
to the Ambrosian free-flowing.
Yeah, I see
composition.
that.
So it's interesting that that distinction exists now at
Mhm.
300. So.
Well, I think that's like the pendulum.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, agreed.
I mean, here you're starting to get a system, and you're playing around with the freedom of that system, but then we get in tight and stick with that system really closely, and then we say, oh, let's stretch out and move away from it a little bit. So I think it's the pendulum kind of doing this.
Yeah, and the same thing happens in rock music
Mhm.
and pop music. You end
Mhm.
up with, your Pink Floyds that are more experimental versus your, Rolling Stones who are more sort
Right.
of like, not mathematical, but regimented,
Yeah.
I'd say. More organized their songs are.
Mm-hmm.
Iam surgitur a tertia, qua Christus ascendit crucem. Nid insolens mens cogite, intendat affectum precis. Qui corde Christum suscipit in nos
Okay, so one bit of structure that St. Ambrose is famous for is that he specifically wrote who should sing these particular chants.
Hmm.
And so he says, I want these to be read by the deacons, I want these to be sung by a boys' choir. And now I didn't do it on purpose, but the three chants that we heard so far, the first one was solo adult male voice. The second one was solo adult male voice alternating with boys choir.
Mm-hmm.
This one we just heard was all boys choir.
Right,
So
right.
it was almost like a blending, you know?
Right.
Of solo adult male to boys choir.
Right, right.
And the second one was a transition to this one. Like I said, I didn't plan that, but that's how it ended up.
Yeah, whatever works.
Now I read a story about St. Ambrose, and he apparently, like any other figure, someone tried to assassinate him.
Of course.
And the way the story goes is when the assassin raised his hand with a dagger in it to strike him, he was paralyzed, and he was, I don't know. It didn't specifically say he was paralyzed by the Holy Spirit, but it did imply there was some divine intervention because It was a miracle, because the guy all of a sudden found that he was paralyzed and could not bring his arm down to strike, and then St. Ambrose lived after that. And
interesting.
so that was one of the stories. And who knows, like you had brought up earlier, there could be a Greek myth that kind of goes along with that. I know.
Well, that doesn't seem. I don't think that seems totally implausible. He probably had a stroke. They're going, oh my God! God is stopping him from step. But he probably just had a stroke. He probably in the middle of having a stroke, couldn't move, couldn't say anything, and everybody just thought it was divine intervention.
Right.
That story doesn't strike me as improbable.
Yeah. Right.
But if that's not the case, and I tend to subscribe to the philosophy that the simplest explanation is probably the best. It seems logical to me that somebody having a stroke would not, they would potentially be paralyzed from on one side of their body.
Mm-hmm. It's one of those. I could even go as far as to say synchronicity,
Right.
like where Jung would say, the probability of having a stroke at that moment is probably pretty small.
Right.
Not saying it's divine intervention, but or if we were to say it's not divine intervention, we could at least agree that it's very synchronous. That
appreciate the
at that moment he had a stroke.
Right.
Like, wow.
Of course. So yeah, but there's probably some Greek myth about. Well, actually, I think in the not the Odyssey, in the Iliad, I think Hector was beating Achilles until I forget which one of the goddesses had put the rock and tripped Hector over.
Right.
Which is how Achilles got the one up on him and then ultimately prevailed. But it's similar to that.
Yeah, yeah. I was racking my brain too to think. I only thought of like Hercules when he was a baby. A snake was supposed to come and bite him. But I don't think the snake became paralyzed. I think Hercules, even as a child, was able to, demonstrate his superior strength and prevent the snake from biting him. I think it was something along those lines. So we'll dispense that and go with the Achilles Hector story.
Yeah. Okay.
Mysticos
So, I wonder if the viewers heard a significant or subtle difference between this final piece and the previous three. Because it tells you, right, the answer is in the album cover. The album cover is Gregorian chants. And here we're explaining and getting involved in what's the difference between Gregorian and Ambrosian chants. And now we find, well, why is the Ambrosian, the chant that St. Ambrose wrote on a Gregorian chant album, why isn't it on the Ambrosian chant album? Well, because St. Ambrose wrote the text, and therefore he is the author of the chants,
Right.
but then they composed the melody using the strict Gregorian notation and system,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's officially under the Gregorian chant category.
Right.
St. Ambrose only wrote 4 that we are confident, and after his death, they continued to use his style of chant, and so Ambrosian chant kind of followed parallel with Gregorian chant.
Mm.
It didn't die away immediately, it kind of continued.
Right.
And so even after his death, we'll hear more Ambrosian chant along the way.
Mm.
And personally, I think some of the most beautiful chants. We'll find out next week. I'll ask your opinion next week. But I'm asking your opinion now. From the 4 that we heard, what are your impressions about St. Ambrose and the Ambrosian chant style?
So, full disclosure, I could not tell the difference between the one that was the Gregorian style and the Ambrosian style.
Mhm.
They seemed very the same.
They do, and they're very, and it's only, I can honestly say it's only because of listening to so much Gregorian chant over the past year when I got sucked into the world of medieval music, and now I hear an Ambrosian chant, I'm like, oh, there's a difference there. I can hear the difference. But it,
Yeah. To the untrained ear.
before this, and I'm not patting myself on the back, but I mean, all the way 50 years up, and I wasn't able to either. But right now, I'm like, oh yeah, there is a Gregorian there, and there is an Ambrosian there. I can hear
Okay. Yeah, I couldn't tell the difference, but I would say that, it sounds okay.
that.
It doesn't sound bad. It sounds about what I expected it to sound like.
Right, and you get that classic picture of the monks in the monastery
Yeah.
just chanting.
Yeah, and then the word you used earlier to describe it, monastic,
Mhm.
I think that's the correct
Yeah.
description.
Mhm.
It's not something that I would be, putting on while I'm getting ready to go out on a night on
Right.
the town, but...
and I don't think it's not meant for that.
Right.
And it's functional. It has its place. It's
Right.
to lift your spirit up during the time of praying, and it's not meant while you're driving in your car to
Right,
go
right.
pick up your girl.
Right, exactly. But it's nice. I think of the 3, so the interesting thing is that the sort of culmination of the tracks that we heard, the solo male, then the mixed, and then the boys choir, and then the final one was the Ambrosian written but Gregorian
Yeah.
style,
Right.
and I think it was a solo male as well with a little bit more reverb.
Mm-hmm.
I think that to my ears, the solo male sounded the best.
Mm-hmm.
The boys' choir is too shrill, I think. I mean, it's
Okay.
very high pitched.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then the one where they kind of it was the boys' choir and the male voice. It was okay, but I think the difference is too stark between the male voice and the boys' choir.
And I think that's what he was going for. I
Yeah.
think he was going for contrast.
Yeah.
Contrast of age in the vocal qualities, contrast of a single voice versus many voices.
Desque fessas allever, luttusque solvat anxios.
Grate sperantai omniet, noctis exortu preces.
We had said off camera that it's not a call and response
Right.
because that particular technique doesn't come up for another couple hundred years. So it was just to provide texture and contrast.
Right. Yeah, but
Mhm.
it was okay. It all sounded pretty good.
There you go. All right.
Deum laudamus, Ti Dominum confidimus, Ti eternum Patrem, omnis terra veneratum, Tibi omnes angeli, Tibi celi et universe potestatis, Tibi cherubim et seraphim, incessabili voce proclamat, Sanctus, Sanctus, Dominus Deus Sabaoth, Regis und Celi et terra, Majestatis Glorie Tuae, Te gloriosus, Apostolorum Tuus, Te prophetarum, laudabilis numerus, Te martyrum candidatus, laudat exercitus, Te per orbem terrarum, Sancta confititur ecclesia.
We're listening to a chant called Te Deum, and it's translated as "We praise Thee, O God." Now, this piece, it's a toss-up on who wrote it. They're really not 100% sure.
Mm.
It could be St. Ambrose, he's in the running, or it could be St. Augustine, he's in the running as well. Now, I kind of think it's cool to say St. Augustine wrote it. I mean,
Yeah.
since we can't confirm, but we can narrow it down to these two, then let's say it's St. Augustine, just for kicks. Because he's a famous philosopher, and let's give him a little...
I have to say, after refreshing my memory on Augustine and his life, he probably needs something under his belt in terms of songs, because let me tell you, this guy is boring. He has lived the most boring life, except for the siege of the Vandals. He literally was a scholar of Rome and Greece. He went to go study, and then he became interested in Christianity and went to study and then teach. So his entire life was studying and teaching until the siege by the Vandals of his hometown, Hippo, where he does some healing and then he dies, and then the Vandals leave actually before he dies. After he dies, the siege ends, and then they come back and sack the city and burn it to the ground, except for his grave, cathedral, and library. So
I read a story about him when I was doing some research, that he was sick in bed, and he does have like a history of being known to cure the sick. And someone came over to him while he was in bed and said, "Can you cure me?" And he said, "If I can cure you, I'd cure myself."
interesting. But Augustine, he does have a pretty interesting philosophy. He starts to bridge the gap between Christianity and Neoplatonism, sort of similar to how Gregory of whatever, Gregory.
The first guy.
Yeah, the first guy we mentioned.
Mhm.
He was trying to bridge the gap between the Hellenistic
Mhm.
traditions and Christianity. Augustine follows that same tradition.
Oh, okay.
And so a lot of his stuff is sort of based in Platonism. He's really obsessed with the harmony of the body and the soul.
Okay.
And then
I was just going to say, remind me what Platonism is.
the theory of the forms.
The theory of the forms.
Right.
Remind me of the theory of the forms.
Yeah, so there's that there's these universal forms that are perfect in all ways, and then the objects themselves are never going to be quite as perfect as the forms, but they're in a manner of speaking aspiring to be them. Like a circular object is not a circle.
So our minds hold the perfect ideal,
Right.
and everything else comes close to matching that,
Right.
but never quite.
Right. And then that was Augustine. He was saying that the soul is sort of the form, the ethereal, and the body is trying to come into harmony with it.
Ah, okay. What you just said reminded me of a title of a book that I confess I didn't read, but As a Man Thinketh is the title of a book, and it kind of reminds me that it's whatever you think, then your body will move towards, and it kind of reminded me of exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, so the concept being that your soul is your perfect you,
Right.
the ideal you,
Mm-hmm.
and your whole goal of living is to bring your body into harmony with the soul.
Right.
And he has a hierarchy of Augustine creates a hierarchy of being, where I think it's being without a soul, then there's being with a soul, and then there's being with a soul and reason.
Mm-hmm.
And so the highest of those would be human. So like a rock is just being, there's no soul.
Mm-hmm.
An animal is being and soul with no reason. Humans are
Oh, wow, okay.
the third, therefore the highest
Right.
on the hierarchy.
Hmm.
Which is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But from what I read, he's not the astute thinker that a lot of people seem to give. He sort of assumes a lot of his basis for his conclusions, whereas and they distinguish him from Plato, where Plato was sort of obsessed with the metaphysics of it.
Mm-hmm.
Augustine sort of just assumes the metaphysics,
Okay.
and probably based on faith in God. But I digress. At any rate,
He really admired St. Ambrose, from what I understand.
well. Then perhaps Augustine wrote this as a sort of a dedication to Saint
Okay,
Ambrose.
so we decided to give an addendum, if you will,
Yes.
to this particular episode, and you can tell we're wearing different shirts, and you're probably thinking, gee, that guy's beard was longer a moment ago. You must have got a haircut. No, they're talking about me. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I really wanted to do was emphasize this piece called the Te Deum.
Yes.
And now, I think it has special significance, and I think it should be on everyone's required listening list. Not because St. Augustine wrote it, but because if we fast forward to even today, we can pick out like 50 composers who actually rewrote it and made it their own piece.
Ah.
And I thought it'd be fun to do a little fast forward and go through some of those and listen to our favorites and maybe something that we've never heard of even.
Right on. Sounds good to me.
So let's give that a shot.
We praise thee, O God.
Okay, so like you said, this is like the ultimate classical cover song.
Yeah, yeah.
And it just starts from 1500s, from Thomas Tallis, all the way up until even today. I think as late as 2010, someone did a version of it.
And probably even earlier than that. I mean, if St. Augustine had written this way back in, what,
300s.
300, 400,
Uh-huh.
somebody probably put this to music before all of these people did.
For sure.
And they did it, you know, the Gregorians, obviously, and
Mhm.
the Ambrosian probably had their own version.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the original cover song.
Yeah.
And actually it's funny that we're talking about this as a cover, because in previous episodes we talked about how music would have come in
Mhm.
and would have potentially been covered by other musicians in Greece. Say,
Right, right.
They import music from Babylon and they say, oh my gosh, this is great, let's play it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that this being a cover is evidence of other songs having been covered at some point by other musicians.
Yeah.
But this, I think, in all the versions that we'll be listening to, seems to be the ultimate cover
Mhm.
song.
Speaking of, we just listened to Henry Purcell's Te Deum,
Yeah.
and
Oh, it was great.
Yeah, wasn't it?
Yeah, the layering of the vocals, the
Mhm.
harmonies, the music in the background. I think it was I'm not an astute ear, but maybe a French horn.
Mhm.
Sounded very English. Very
and very Baroque.
yeah, very Baroque.
1694 he wrote this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's smack dab in the beginning of the Baroque era.
And it sounds very ceremonial.
Mhm.
Anytime,
Yeah, it's
anytime,
like a pomp and circumstance
yes,
type of thing.
exactly. And
Mhm.
it's a lot to do with the horns
Yeah.
that make it sound so prestigious.
hmm
Um,
Like you're walking down a red carpet, long cathedral type place.
exactly.
hmm
But great, I think it sounds great,
Yeah.
and stark contrast to what the Gregorians did.
Oh, yeah.
Stark contrast.
hmm
The Gregorians were it's like almost liturgical.
Yeah, and when I went back and re-listened to the Gregorian chant, I noticed, and very indicative to Gregorian chant, the melody line really stays close. You know,
Mhm.
it's na 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 na, a very very horizontal melody.
Yeah.
Where here you're getting a lot of dynamics to
Yes.
a larger range. And so you're really making a song out of it,
Yeah.
not just a
Well,
prayer.
and far more elements. I mean, the Gregorians, it's people chanting.
Right.
Here, you've got male singers,
Mhm.
you got female singers, the horns. There's probably strings that I wasn't attuned to while we were listening. So you've got elements upon elements that are just layered on. But it's so different. So I mean, just the time difference really in terms of what how prolonged Purcell's version is from the Gregorian chant. we
Right,
listen
right,
to.
yeah.
It's that, like you said, the Gregorian is very linear. It's just there's no dynamics. It's in a straight line.
Mhm.
It follows that same set pattern, and there's no theatricality to it. It's
Right.
kind of just straight on through.
Mhm.
Where with Purcell, we've got the horns are blaring, and
Mhm.
oh my goodness, look at this, and then the vocals are sort of layered over top of each other.
Uh-huh.
So it's much more,
Beautiful.
yeah,
Is the
much
word
more-
you use.
It's much more beautiful,
Yeah.
but it's not. Purcell wasn't trying, I don't think, to be functional. I mean, he was
Right.
trying to make beautiful music.
Mhm. I agree.
So,
Yeah.
differences.
Uh-huh. And speaking of differences, there's a lot of music to come ahead.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we're going to find a lot of differences. Let's
Oh yeah.
crash into another one.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and that was the version by Handel, written in 1743.
Yeah.
Huge.
Yeah, yeah. Way bigger than even Purcell.
Monstrous.
Um,
And for the viewers, what Handel did was he made a movement out of each line of the hymn.
Yeah.
And so the hymn is about 18 lines, and Handel has 18 movements, each about 4 or 5 minutes long. So it ends up being this huge oratorio
Yeah.
instead of just a 6-minute hymn.
Right, right. And probably for good reason. I mean, if you spend a lot of time on a single sentence and explicating that sentence musically speaking,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to find greater significance in what it is that you're like meditating on, right? So
Mhm.
if you're we praise thee, O God. 5 words. You're really going to have to focus in on 5 words and think about what those 5 words mean musically in
Mhm.
order to compose what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think the opening movement is so big.
Right, right.
And it comes in real loud as soon as the vocals start singing. It starts off kind of lower. There's a lot of the fugue layering. Really cool. Really cool.
Yeah.
Really different
Yeah.
than Purcell. But I think Handel was approaching this with a little bit more. I would say he's probably more interested in the theology behind the Te Deum
Uh-huh.
than Purcell was.
Right, right.
And that's why it's significant that he would have a movement per line.
Mm-hmm. And also, we're moving from the Baroque period to the Classical period, and so that may also have something to do with the real intense magnification. And speaking of which, who comes right after Handel is Mozart. We got to give Mozart a listen.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay, that was the Mozart piece, and it was written in 1769.
And Mozart was 13 when he wrote that piece.
Unbelievable. You believe that? 13. What were you doing at 13?
I scraping my knees, falling off bicycles.
Right?
I wasn't composing anything similar.
No kidding. My gosh. That was just amazing.
Yeah.
And it's such a nice piece of music, too.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
very Mozartian, if that is a word. We'll construct one right now.
Right.
But it for being 13, he had like all of his essence in that piece. All the essence to come anyway. I mean, it distinguished it. It deliberately sounded like Mozart.
Well, I think, as a prodigy, he probably had established his modality early in life and just stuck with him for the remainder of
It must have.
of the time. But interesting to note that he had met Bach 3 to 4 years before composing this piece. So, and he would have been 10 or 11, maybe
Right.
12
Right.
at the time. So,
And who knows what influence Bach would have had on him.
Right.
I mean, I didn't hear a direct influence,
No.
but I mean that doesn't mean it didn't percolate some,
right.
potential in him that just exploded.
Or motivation. Bach was really motivated by Christianity. A lot of his stuff had to do with Christianity,
Right,
composed
yeah.
in churches.
Yeah.
So I don't know if maybe that was an element that inspired Mozart, a young Mozart, meeting this famous composer
Yeah.
at 10, who might be his idol. It's like a 10-year-old baseball prodigy meeting.
Right. Babe
Barry,
Ruth.
yeah, Babe Ruth or Barry Bonds. Somebody who's,
Right.
oh my God, this is your hero. You've met your hero. But yeah, fascinating. And again, I think consistent. What we've seen is the big energy.
Yeah.
Real big energy immediately.
Yeah. They take it. It's gone from this single line chant to this huge explosive. Pay attention to this.
Yeah, exactly.
And interesting that Mozart chose to keep it in the original Latin, where the previous ones, we didn't go through all of them because there's just so many, but we did listen to two. We listened to Purcell, and then we listened to Handel, and they did English versions, or English translations, but Mozart said, I'm doing Latin.
Yeah, no, I don't know why. I wonder if it's because Mozart was composing for like kings, that he was maybe trying to hold himself to a higher standard. I won't keep the peasant language in the halls of these great people. I'll keep,
Now, at a particular episode, you and I discussed how language can have its own aura, and do you think that there was a difference between hearing it in Latin versus hearing it in English?
I think there's more significance to hearing it in Latin versus hearing it in English. I mean, part of, and we discussed this, was, part of the reason Martin Luther did what he did was because of the disconnect between the church and the common folk.
Right.
And so there's this, like, sense of exclusion by having it in the Latin, in the original
Correct.
Latin. And so it's the high language. It's the language of the priests. And if you think about the hierarchy of Europe at the time, the priests were pretty, held in high esteem. So you would imagine that there's this, sense of, if it's in Latin, that's really official. I mean, you think about even English or even like imperial doctrines tend to be in Latin. In fact, I got one of my degrees from a Catholic school, and my diploma is in Latin.
Right. Nice.
So,
At the same time, when it's kept in a language that you don't necessarily understand, there's a sense where you have to project meaning onto it. And I think that when you know that it's a biblical work or a spiritual work, and it's sung in a language that you don't understand, you're projecting your own spiritualness into it, and it gives it that sense of reverence and holiness that it's meant to.
or even from Mozart's perspective, when he's composing in a language that most people probably don't understand, he has to impose his own meaning
Through the music.
Through the music.
Right, nice.
So it's both. It's the reaction of the listener, but also the composer who has to say this meaning, this is really big meaning, and that's why I think, even though we don't speak Latin and we know what the words are because we've seen the translation, but we can tell as soon as they start singing, "We praise thee, O God," how big and how meaningful it is.
Right.
Just through the music itself, we don't have to speak the language.
Well, speaking of big and meaningful, let's find the next big and meaningful version.
Okay.
That was a version by Haydn, Franz Joseph Haydn, and it was written in 1800. And just as an asterisk, Haydn was considered the father of the symphony. He probably didn't write the first symphony, but I think he perfected it, refined it, and accumulated 107 of them.
Right. And it's immediately apparent that that title belongs to him. Because
Yeah, it sounds so streamlined.
Yeah.
Like, it's like going from a Model T to today's car. He
Right,
definitely's got today's car.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But like all the rest of them, starts off pretty big. And even when the vocals come in again, I think there's that sense of grandiosity.
Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely not a quiet piece so far in any of the ones we've listened to.
No, but interestingly, so different. Again, so even from Purcell, each one has been so starkly different from the next.
Yeah.
That I honestly can't wait until we get to this part in our chronological listening, because we're going to start to see some of the real differences drive out in terms of classical music.
And you know what? When I first heard that there was 50, 60 composers who rescored the Te Deum, what I was expecting was the exact melody of the Gregorian chant, but with some embellishment and some musical accompaniment. No way, man. These guys are like, boom, this is my piece.
Yeah. and it's interesting that, like, you know, and again, this is the classical era, so I think that there is an obsession almost at this time with ancient Greek, the ancient Greeks, and it's not a surprise that you know, these composers are composing, so, or at least most of them, and there were probably more prodigies then than ever. Because I think at this time there's a real obsession with, in the same way that the Greeks were obsessed with music,
Right.
obsession with music and learning music and teaching music to the next generation.
Yeah.
That we're starting to see, and that's why I think that the evolution of music in this time period from 1600 until 1800 is so rapid. Everything changes so quickly.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, part and parcel of the obsession of. So we've actually seen what I would say, effectively, the second coming of Greece.
Right. I can totally see that.
In this time period.
Like a Greek revival in a sense.
Yeah. Well, and that was the inspiration
Right.
for a lot of this, was to go back to the Greeks. What were the Greeks and the Romans doing, right? So.
Okay, Felix Mendelssohn, 1826. Starts off with a bang, just like all the others.
Yeah, immediately. I mean, just it's almost like the Star Wars theme,
Right? Yeah.
Right. Which is, you know, so in anticipation of an epic.
Right.
And as we know, John Williams, inspired by the Greeks when he composed the Star Wars theme, so he was probably keeping in mind that this is an epic. But Mendelssohn does the same thing with the Te Deum.
Yeah.
It kind of opens real big and then starts to weave the voices.
Okay, so now that we know what it's about, we praise thee, O God. Why do you think this particular piece became the cover song?
That's a really good question.
I mean,
probably because it's the most complete prayer in praise of the God, and I think this was the Apostles' Creed. I think this was crafted after, which is like one of the fundamental creeds of Christianity. So I would say that the Te Deum probably represents the most complete prayer to the Lord.
Right, yeah.
As opposed to, I mean, although I would be surprised to know that the Lord's Prayer was put to music. I'm sure that somebody has done it at some time, but probably not. And I don't know when the Lord's Prayer was even composed to say.
We did an episode where we had a few recordings of it. I think the episode "Music in the Time of Jesus." So it was written around that time. And it has been put to music, but not as extensively as this, I don't think.
No, and I wonder if maybe this is, or like that was more reserved for quiet contemplation, where the Te Deum was more meant for, because, you know, the Gregorians wrote it down and chanted, so it was more meant for more boisterous, what would the word be, when you're lifted up in song, right, as opposed to meditative.
Rejoicing. Yeah,
it's more of a rejoicing, probably. And then it starts off, we praise thee. The whole thing is about how wonderful God is,
right?
And how much we praise Him.
So it's like a Dr. Pepper commercial for God.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I mean, so it makes sense.
Jumping in the streets and dancing. You
know?
know?
So it makes sense that this would be the one that is most
right.
You know, it's probably the one. And again, I mean, if you come back to what Handel did. He's, did a movement for each sentence.
Yeah.
And so there's probably, I would say for these gentlemen, real significance to the Te Deum in terms of their emotive states when they're writing music.
Right. Exaggeration, but 1885. Anton Bruckner, 1885.
Yeah.
And that was just amazing.
Yeah.
Holy cow. I mean, there was so much. There was beauty, there was suspense, there was awe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, awe.
Yeah. and again, so different from all the and in this one when we got to the song, the line that starts with Sancta, and again this is in the Latin, this version,
Right.
and not in the English, which is odd because we're getting closer to modernity.
Mm-hmm. Sanctus means holy, and
Right.
so there's the line is Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus.
It gets very. Well, it almost sounded like it was in a minor key.
And whispering or pianissimo. And
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
very
yeah. Very low
yeah.
and wispy and kind of dark.
Yeah.
Which is
I had this image of like clouds.
yeah, yes.
You know, not very clearly defined, just kind of cloudy. And,
But then boom
Yeah.
comes through again,
Right,
as
yeah.
if it was
like a big stream of light.
Yeah,
or
like
something.
letting the light through. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And interesting that I like the use of the instruments. I felt like the examples or pieces leading up to this one, the words and the vocals were the foreground, and the instruments kind of embellished that. But I felt like here the instrumentation went side by side of importance with the vocals in the text.
Yeah, definitely. It wasn't like you said, it wasn't like the voices were outshining the instrumentation. So, but interestingly enough, immediately my first reaction was that it had a lot of the pomp and circumstance that we heard from Purcell.
Right. Yeah.
As opposed to the more moderated symphony feel that we got from Haydn. So, again, I mean, it's just another
Right.
crazy interpretation, radically different interpretation of this song.
Yeah, very much so. Dvorak, 1892. Impression?
I just knew it was going to be different. Right off the bat with those big timpanis, just
Yeah.
boom, 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 real big. Almost reminds me of 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Okay.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
but the other interesting thing about his writing in general, I mean, this has been the most different. I mean, this I think is an outlier in terms of what we listened to so
Right.
far, because the percussion stands out so much.
Yeah. I mean, and he lets you know right up front, there's got to be heavy percussion.
There's going to be a lot of percussion, yeah.
Boom, boom, boom with the timpanis.
Mhm. And then there's like a constant ringing on a triangle.
Mhm.
The crash coming together,
Mhm.
the timpanis in the background. Almost the percussion stands out more against the rest of the orchestra.
Yeah.
They
They almost have a front seat,
Mhm.
or at least they're side by side with the singers.
Yeah, yeah. Which might be for a reason.
Mhm.
I wasn't keeping track of this while we were listening, but it could be that in some of the tradition that we've seen already, that the singers were following the percussion. So the melody, the rhythm was laid out by the percussionists, in sort of the same way that we hear with the Greeks, where they'll pluck
Right.
the singing. It could
Yeah.
be that the percussion is sort of guiding the rhythm of the vocals.
Mhm. Yeah, it was a very exciting piece.
Very exciting.
I mean, like the soundtrack to an action movie, you know?
Right. It was big, and this is, I think, so far the biggest that we've heard.
Oh, it just keeps getting bigger.
Just because of the drums.
Right.
Just boom, right in your face. So I'm excited to see who's next.
Okay. Giuseppe Verdi, 1898. And, you know, I had to keep looking at the clock to make sure it was actually going and it didn't stop or,
Right.
or you know, get caught in a crash or something like that, because there was so much silence and so low you can hear a pin drop. But obviously, for a reason, because when he got to that Sanctus, wow, man, he blew your socks off.
Yeah.
Do you need more socks? Because we might have to get some after
Yeah,
this.
I wasn't quite sure what was gonna unfold there, because
Mhm.
it was like you said, very quiet,
Yeah.
which he might have done intentionally.
Oh, yeah.
He might have. I'm sure he's aware at this point
Mhm.
that other composers have done a Te Deum,
Right.
and this is probably, you know, a rite of passage for some composers.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well.
You're not established until you've done
Until
your
you write it
Te
down,
Deum, right? And so he probably wanted to set himself apart.
Mhm.
So everybody else starts with this bah right in your
Yeah.
face, real big, and so he's
He
quiet.
waits.
Yeah,
Mhm,
real quiet.
makes you wait for it.
hmm Lots of anticipation in this
Yeah.
piece.
Yeah, it worked though.
Yeah, it really
Yeah.
did.
Yeah, it really
did.
worked.
It's interesting to see that as we've progressed,
Hmm.
and as we get closer to modernity, we're starting to see radically different sounding music from where we started with Purcell, and then as we progress through with Handel and the rest.
And both of our first reaction was the sounds Gregorian.
Yes.
It almost sounded like he was starting with the chant
Mm-hmm.
as a reminder. Hey, this is what it sounded like, and here's the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're gonna move away.
And it's almost like he wound it down, right? It
Mhm.
started with the tradition. The tradition is sort of lost, and now boom! This is
Yeah.
what music sounds like now. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
It was almost he draws the comparison between the original Gregorian and where
Mhm.
we are in musical composition,
Right.
up to the point where he is, which is interesting.
I think he did that.
He probably did that on purpose.
Mhm. Ralph Vaughan Williams, written in 1928. We're really starting to get to modernity now.
Oh yeah,
And does this sound modern?
more so than Purcell,
Mhm.
but not as modern as, well, I guess I don't even know what modern classical music would be.
Sure.
What it would sound like, to be honest with you.
Right, understood. But and then scrap the question. Impressions about this one?
It's interesting.
Mhm.
Again, very different.
Yeah.
I just can't get over how different all of these
Each
pieces
one
are.
is, yeah.
Every single one. There's almost no similarity.
Mhm.
I mean, there's a constant theme of big and in your face and
Mhm.
joyous. But this one, and you mentioned what he does with the melody. One thing that it sounded like to me, that my first impression when I heard the ba na 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 sounded very Eastern influence. It almost had a Chinese sort of feel to it.
Oh, all right.
Just like you would imagine in terms of like a ceremonial, they clang and then do 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 do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I just sounded, I would say Chinese more so than Japanese, but very very Eastern sounding.
Wow. I didn't get that necessarily, but I'd have to listen to it again.
Mm.
And I'm not sure, maybe that he could have been going for something like that.
Mm.
Have to look at his repertoire and see if he has any other pieces that have some influence like that.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Mhm.
You know, around that time in Britain, I think you were seeing a lot of the Eastern influence coming over
Right.
from the colonies,
In India too. Right?
from India, right? And so they were
Mhm.
probably importing a lot of the Eastern culture
Mhm.
into Britain.
Right.
And so it wouldn't surprise me if he had had heard something that
Mhm.
inspired him in some way.
Yeah. Right.
But also interesting, he wrote this one in the English.
Yeah, right. Which is a departure kind of a departure. We're getting it's almost like a crapshoot, whether it's going to be in English or it's going to be in Latin.
Yeah, and the other thing to note, this was written after World War One.
Okay.
So you have to imagine, the crazy things that people saw during World War One, and if that had any inspiration in terms of it. So you would think that, coming out of such a terrible war, that you'd want your culture to be, revivified. And,
Right.
So maybe that's why he put it in English, as a sort
Okay.
of, English language is the best language.
Right. Yeah. And it had a very British style.
Very British style.
The music did, as well as the vocals. So yeah, I think you're right. It kind of has a sense of nationalism. Good observation. That was Arvo Part, written in 1984. And he's one of my favorites. I like him a lot. I mean, I've liked all of them, but when I'm just not doing homework for the podcast and I'm just listening to my own stuff, I go to him quite frequently. I like his stuff. Soothing.
Yeah.
And that's what this was. Even I mean, it started off, like you even said, this sounds like the beginning to Lord of the Rings, because it's very like, oh.
Yeah, very ominous.
Yeah, down and like backgroundy type of something can layer on top of it. And then, but even when he comes up with the full choir, it was still soothing, you know, like it was a nice massage.
Yeah, it didn't have all the pomp and circumstance, but
No.
I think it had all of the meaning.
Right, right.
So he didn't lose anything in terms of his delivery.
No. It was almost like he was reminding us of Gregorian chant and almost implying the functionality of chant and prayer and meditation and contemplation.
with that low end
Yeah.
sort of meditative. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
But it was good. I like this.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. I mean, and it's a 21-minute piece.
Mm.
I can listen to the whole 20 minutes.
I like it. Who else you got?
That brings us to the final one we'll listen to, Jenkins, written in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this one's lively.
Yeah.
And bum-ba-dum, does that not get stuck in your head?
Yeah. Plus the march, that snare drum behind that's just constantly going.
Which I think is unique to all the others, because all the others, I heard the Te Deum and I heard the Te Deum, but there wasn't a melody that got stuck in my head like this does.
Mm-hmm.
Dun, 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 dun. That's just stuck in my head, and I want to keep hearing it like a pop song, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Really great, really great.
Yeah. And again, this is probably more what I would say a modern musical composition, 2010.
Right, yeah. And in Latin.
Yeah, and in Latin, interestingly.
Mm-hmm.
He probably has, I wonder if he's, how devout he is as a Christian.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But interesting that the words were very clear.
Oh, yeah.
I can read along perfectly. Some of the other ones, so if you go back and re-listen to some of the other ones, the words are a little muddy because there's so many people and there's so much weaving in and out and the inflections, and sometimes I actually had a hard time following along, but I knew, once I got to the Sanctus or whatever. But this is real clear. Each word is distinct.
Yeah. Yeah, very distinct. Is he American? So I asked if he was American because this seems to me to be very American.
I agree. I thought he was American too, but he's not. He's Welsh.
Yeah, he's Welsh,
Mm-hmm.
which I can't say anything about Wales.
Yeah,
So,
I don't know much about it.
Right.
Yeah.
I can't say whether this is consistent with the Welsh culture.
But we can say it sounds American.
It sounds very American.
Yeah.
Very organized, very
Mhm.
linear, very compartmental. Everything's compartmentalized.
Yeah.
You hear the vocals clearly. You hear that snare drum clearly.
And there's that time element that's like a
Yeah.
clock.
Yeah, exactly. Very consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will say, and perhaps this is a digression of the point, I like the early classical composers as opposed to Jenkins.
Oh, okay.
I would say of all of the versions that we've listened to, Jenkins is my least favorite.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
I think that's good because we both have our contrasting preferences.
Yeah.
I really like the Jenkins.
I like the intertwining. I like
Uh-huh.
having to try to like you're on an adventure.
Right,
and you're
right.
having to pick out who's saying
Seek and
what.
find.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Uh-huh.
like a Bach fugue where things are layered and you have to try to really pay attention to hear the layers.
Right, right.
Whereas Jenkins is like straight, right? You know, it's a
Mhm.
march. It feels
Yeah.
like a march. You're
Yeah, it
marching
really does.
straight.
It's propelling you forward.
Yeah, yeah. Different feel. I just
Mhm.
I get more out of the earlier
Right.
composers.
Right.
But that being said, I mean, I think what Jenkins has done is unique.
Mm-hmm.
Of all of the ones that we've listened to, again, this
Right.
is the most unique.
Right.
And part and parcel of that is because it's the most modern.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got more at his disposal.
Agreed.
And I think the recording quality that we have today
Mm-hmm.
probably doesn't really fit well with the classical composers.
Well, and also keep in mind that 2010, you don't want to repeat what someone else has done.
Mm.
And so they've already done it all. So what have you got left?
Right, right.
All right, we'll have a march.
Right. A march to God.
Yeah, right.
That's kind of what it is.
Yeah.
Jerusalem, my happy home, when shall I come to thee? When shall my sorrows have an end? Thy joys, when shall I see? O happy home of the saints, O sweet and pleasant soil, in thee no sorrow may be found, no grief, no care, no toil. Thy ways are made of precious stones, thy bulwarks of diamond square, thy gates are of right orient pearl, exceeding rich and rare. Thy turrets and thy pinnacles with carbuncles do shine. Thy very streets are paved with gold, surpassing clear and fine. Quite through the streets with silver song, the flood of life doth flow. Upon whose banks on every side the wood of life doth grow. Their trees forevermore bear fruit, and evermore do spring. There evermore the end.
Okay, we just listened to Virgil Thompson, Jerusalem, My Happy Home, text or words by St. Augustine, and it was sung in English,
Yeah.
and we had just had a discussion on how languages can have their own flavor. We both agreed that Latin kind of has a holiness or monasticness. Do you think this had monastic or holiness to it?
No, I don't think that it did. It sounded more like an opera to me.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is probably the style of the time when he was composing,
Mhm.
trying to be more of that. I think, I forget the operatic languages. I know Italian is one and German. Is English an official language that opera is sung in? Do you know?
They do have operas in English, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it didn't sound holy. It sounded, I don't know, I just...
Pedestrian.
Yeah, I guess that's a good word for it.
Yeah, just commonplace.
Yeah, it's not something that I think it would stand out in church
Mhm.
because it would be, I would feel like it doesn't belong
Mhm.
in a church.
Mm-hmm.
But if this was on a Broadway stage,
It wouldn't stand out
It
there
wouldn't
either.
stand out. That's where I would imagine that this would be sung.
Mm-hmm.
But if they got up and started playing this in a church, I'd question it, especially in the Catholic Church, where some, or at least some Catholic churches still have their ceremonies and whatever
Mhm.
in Latin. I think it would stand out there.
Now I don't know if Virgil Thompson meant for this to be a religious song to be sung in church or anything like that.
Right.
I don't know. I'm just saying.
Right.
I have another question. Since Virgil Thompson is an American composer, and there are like national sounding pieces, just like the languages have a certain flavor. The musical pieces that come out of countries have a certain, like Spanish music is very
Yes.
distinct, and Chinese music is very distinct.
Right.
And then there's also American music. Aaron Copland really strove to put out American music, and Leonard Bernstein
Mhm.
strove to put out American sounding music. Do you think this sounds American?
I guess it's got an American flavor to it, but yeah, I don't know. I don't really know how to pinpoint it because
Mhm.
the piano is sort of sporadic.
Mhm.
I guess I'd say the melody of the piano was sporadic.
Mm-hmm.
The singer is belting in the sort of opera way that you would sing,
Mm-hmm.
which again I don't fully know where I would classify that geographically speaking.
Right.
That type of singing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it's got American flavor to it.
Okay.
I don't think I'd call it American though.
Right. Okay. Just wanted to throw it out there. I really tried to hone in on the vocals and the piano, and I can confidently say that he's not using Gregorian modes.
No, I don't think so either.
Yeah. So he certainly is moving away from any of the roots of that Saint Augustine established for
Mhm.
himself anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like he just took something Augustine wrote and
Yeah.
made it into a song.
Yeah.
Either commemorating or whatever, paying homage to,
Mhm.
to Augustine as a thinker, as a theologian. It is interesting that this was an American that did this because you think about the evolution of European theology
Mhm.
up until the point of the American Revolution. They had sort of reached their climax and had begun a decline probably sometime around the 1700s where they had the Church of England sort of breaking away from the Catholic Church. You had the Protestant uprisings throughout the Middle Ages. So Christianity was sort of becoming less and less a part of everyday people's lives. It was sort of a background thing.
Mhm.
Whereas in America, I think that there's especially around the time that he was composing, there was sort of a revivification of the church in America's in the common person.
Mhm.
Mostly through Protestant traditions. So it is interesting that that an American would be the one
Mhm.
to pick up an Augustine piece and
Right.
write it to music.
Right. So we started off with a poet and a very small fragment. We moved into chant proper, Ambrosian chant, the introduction of Ambrosian chant,
Mhm.
some a single piece probably attributed to Saint Augustine.
Mm-hmm.
Impressions overall today's episode.
The music sounds like what I expected it
Mhm.
to sound like.
Mhm.
And it is interesting to note the difference between the Ambrosian chant and the Gregorian chant. Because, again, I still can't tell the difference,
Mm-hmm.
but knowing that there is a difference, I'm going to be a little bit more keen to try to pick up on what
Yeah.
distinguishes a Gregorian chant from other types of chanting.
Well, and don't pull your hair out over it.
Right.
I have already. But, and I say that because there's also going to be Malachite chants
Right.
and Sarum chants and Gallic chants, and they all have their own fine tune that distinguishes this from the other, and it
Right.
could only be something like we did it on this note and not that note.
Right.
And so it is really hard, even when I'm listening to it, to say what's the difference. And even when I go and read about it, they're very vague, and I can't pinpoint and say, yeah, that's what Gallic chant is versus Gregorian.
Right. Right.
But but I try, and so will you.
Yes.
And anything else before we wrap up today's episode?
Nothing besides to say that I would not recommend any of this to a friend.
Right. I think it, like I said earlier, I think it has its place, and the place isn't for casual listening.
No.
Well,
Indeed not.
we explored the 300 to 400 period. Next week we'll do 400 to 500. Hopefully we'll see you then.
Stay tuned.